And we do have many visitors and guests here today. And so it's kind of a very mixed crowd. So for some of you, I know this is your first ever bar mitzvah of any kind. Some of you may have been to some before. Some of you, it may be your first time at a Messianic Jewish congregation. And some things, including a brief explanation of what a bar mitzvah is. If you look in your bulletin there's some little terms and things. Sometimes we say things, we don't even realize we're saying them, and you're wondering, what did he say? So there you may, what did I see? What was just happened? And so there's a few things that are explained in there, in the bulletin. And again, some of you have never been to a Messianic Jewish congregation before, so regarding what that is, I thought I would attempt to give you what Rabbi Chaim often calls the 35,000-foot flyover. So it's kind of like, not all the details, and kind of some stuff. You're more than welcome to maybe ask me some other questions, maybe another day, not today necessarily, but I'm just going to give you some of the high flyover type of things, in case you're wondering about that. So a Messianic Jewish congregation is very simply just a place where Jewish people as well as non-Jewish people worship the same God, but in a distinctively Jewish way, with Hebrew and with Jewish traditions. And we believe the entirety of the Bible. And when I say that, I mean from the book of Genesis, which is written by a Jewish guy named Moses, all the way through the New Covenant Scriptures, which is the last book in there is a book called Revelation, written also by another Jewish guy named Yochanan. John, you may have heard of him. He was called a shaliach, or an apostle. And so we believe the entirety of that, that book, both that Tanakh as well as what's called the Brit Hadashah, which is the New Covenant. And the New Covenant is actually spoken about by the prophet Jeremiah, the Jewish prophet Jeremiah, in chapter 31. If you read chapter 31 of that book, it's actually for the house of Israel, the house of Jacob. And so we believe that God is in fact the same, has never changed from yesterday to now and to forever. And then specifically for us, we hold that belief in Yeshua. This is really what Jesus' mother called him, most likely. His mom was Miriam and Yosef, and called him Yeshua. We believe that belief in him it's a very Jewish thing. It's very consistent with the Hebrew Scriptures. In fact, if you were here next week, we've been looking at the life of Abraham. And we're preaching through kind of all the narratives about Abraham, and we're in chapter 18, and probably look into a little bit of 19 next week. And you see in there actually an example where Abraham is visited by three people. They look like people, they eat, and so forth. They're also angelic, we see that. And then we also see that one of them actually is God himself, in the flesh. So we'll see that very, very specifically next week. So we recognize that the biblical and theological roots, so to speak, of Judaism, and very broadly, the roots of what I'll just call Christianity broadly, they're identical. Theologically speaking, non-Jewish people who believe that Yeshua is the Messiah really are adopted Jews, when you study the theology and the biblical support behind it. Adopted into that line. So, in fact, as early as when you look at this story, the portion that Zach was in this week was called Exodus. So that's the English, the Latin word we know, Exodus, but it comes from the Hebrew Shemot, because it talks about the numbers of people that came out of Egypt in slavery. And if you want the authoritative version of this, I think Disney's put out a thing, Prince of Egypt, right? That's the one. But that's the story. That's the story of this whole section. It's actually a pretty good movie. I think it's fairly accurate. But that's the whole story. And when you look at that whole story, when the Jewish people are led out of slavery by Moses, you see a mixed multitude. And you see this continued all throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. There's always Jews and non-Jews traveling together, worshiping together. And that's what we continue to do today here. And today in particular, I think it's kind of unique and illustrative that while Yeshua Tzion, we are in the process of looking for our own facility. That's something that we've been led to do for a long time, and we're moving in that direction, finding a permanent home. I think it's kind of illustrative that we get to have this Jewish bar mitzvah in this facility, Greenwood Community Church. Quite frankly, I see it as a very vivid representation of the unity that we should experience among our communities, quite frankly. Especially refreshing, and I think especially important in light of a lot of stuff we see today in terms of anti-Semitism and attacks on Jews, and not only in our country but abroad, as well as acts of violence that are just taking place in churches as well. So I think it's kind of a neat, vivid representation of that unity and of our vision as a Messianic Jewish community. And so just as a little segue there, I want to take just a moment to thank Greenwood Community Church, who's been a great host for us for many years. When the time does come for us to move out, I know we're going to be sad about that. We're going to miss them. We're going to miss their hospitality. And just on that line, I want to thank the guy who's not paying attention up there in the sound booth. There he is. You wave his hand. Jordan is part of Greenwood here, and this brand new. This has just been redone as a state-of-the-art facility that they've got here with sound and video. And so thank you, Jordan, for helping us to be heard and seen today. And maybe too seen for you. Maybe I'm too light. I don't know. But also thanks to my good friend Pastor Doug Brown, he leads this community here, Greenwood Community Church, and he's celebrating with us today. And I want to thank you for coming. I warned you I would do that, so it's okay. You don't put you on spot. Any other staff that's in the building today, I didn't see any, but if they're here, I want to thank them too, because we interact with them throughout the weeks and as well as every Shabbat. So it's a real pleasure, and again, it's going to be bittersweet when we end up pulling up the tent pegs, as Chaim often talks about, and expanding the tent. So a bar mitzvah, that's what you're here today for. And again, it's simply, as you can read, it means a son of the commandment, or a daughter of the commandment, when we have a bat mitzvah. And so the question is, whose commandment? I'd love to say that Zach now is a son of my command. He's going to do whatever I say, whatever I've commanded him, like he kind of alluded to in his thing there, that he's always done what we told him. But that's not the fact. Really, it's God's commandments that he's decided to come under. And Jews for centuries have been saying a lot of the same words. When you read the Jewish prayer books, you see, or if you ever go to someone's house for a Shabbat, or you go there for Hanukkah, or some other, if you come to our Passover Seder, you'll hear one of the most common refrains. Anytime a sitcom, for example, is trying to make a character Jewish, they always start off with the same thing, Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, that kind of thing. And so that's a prayer that's said over and over again. And I want to just look at that for a second. You've got Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Eloheinu melech haolam, King of the universe. And then it goes into Asher Kitshanu, the one who has sanctified us or set us apart. And again, we say this, many people should say this all the time. Maybe we don't even think about it, it's kind of subconscious. But he has set us apart. That means that we are God's, we are his own, there's a purpose, and we're set apart as his creation for a purpose. And then we say, the mitzvotav, by his commandments. And when people hear commandments, sometimes they bristle a little bit. And these are just, I want to make it clear, these are not just, we're saying rules, by God's rules, but really it's by his standards. And I think if we would go over these things are laid out in the Torah and elsewhere, that God's standards are really things that anybody here would most likely agree upon. A lot of them are the fruit that Zach talked about earlier, this kindness and gentleness and peace and patience and love. So we say, blessed are you, God, who has set us apart by these things. We should be different in that way. And it says, vitzivanu, and then it means, and you have not only given us these commandments, but you then commanded us to then go do those same things in like manner. And then we often add, after that, you've commanded us to light these candles. You've commanded us to observe this holiday, and so forth. So in Judaism, this is a continual refrain that's being said. This idea of being thankful to God and recognizing him for who he is and what he has done, and for who we are as a part of his creation, and then also doing likewise. And so the foundation of a person's humanity, in other words, their belief in what they're about, where they came from, that's critical, I think, to how they're going to, in fact, live their life, how they're going to behave, how they're going to treat others. And contrary to popular belief, they don't just, these values, these morals, they don't just materialize out of nothing. There's something behind them, okay? Because if we just did what was the most advantageous kind of things, things wouldn't be this way, But as God said to Moses in this section of the Torah, as Moses was making excuses, Zach laid that out a little bit for you. He was talking about his abilities in particular. He said, my speaking abilities, I can't really talk. That was one of the excuses he made. And God said, look, who made man's mouth, or who makes a person that they can speak or that they can hear? Who makes someone mute or deaf? Who makes somebody seeing or blind? Is it not I? The answer, the rhetorical answer to that question is yes, it is him. In other words, what he's saying there, and what God was trying to get across to Moses, is that life is not necessarily about you, what he was trying to tell him. All these excuses Moses was given. I can't do this, I can't do that, they won't listen to me, who are you, who shall I say? You know what, I can't talk, God's saying, look, it's not about you. And it's not about Zach today. It's not about me. It's not about anybody that has spoken up here today. But it's about the one who made us. That's what this is about. And that may be difficult for people to accept. But at some point, I think a person is faced with those decisions. Where did I come from? Where am I going? And who's in control? And when you start thinking about those questions, there's really not many options. There's not a lot of options to answer that question. And to be frank, though, in all fairness, just about all of those options have difficulties with them. So it's not just a snap decision. There's things to explore and to research and to pray about, because there's problems with all of those. But regardless of the problems, a decision has to be made at some point. It really does. No decision is a decision. And that really directs how you're going to live. And so each of us has a background. Each of us is in a particular time, in a particular place in our life, and maybe in a lot of ways we're comfortable, completely comfortable, like Moses was in Midian. That's kind of the picture you get when Zach said about he was just kind of minding his own business before that bush flamed and caught his attention. But none of that erases the bigger picture for Moses, and then the bigger picture for you and me, and namely, that there is a time to leave Midian amidst that comfort. There's a time to leave, and there's a time to get on track for your ultimate purpose in life, whatever that may be. And Moses, he wasn't jumping at that opportunity. He wasn't excited about it. And he didn't want to, and neither will you. In fact, the very first line of what Zach read today tells us that Moses went about as far away as possible from where he was ultimately supposed to be. I'm sure you remember that when Zach was reading, right? When he was blazing through that. He said, Vayinchag ha'atzon achar hamidbar. Remember that? Yeah. He said, so he led the flock to the farthest end of the wilderness, coming to the Mount of God, which is Mount Horeb, which also is known as Mount Sinai. That's actually on that back of that Hebrew sheet you've got. Let's have that English there. That's where this all happened, when he had gone pretty much the furthest away from where he thought, but yet he was actually going right to the foot of God, which is kind of funny. But that's where Moses met with God, when he was running away. And as Zach said, minding his own business, it turns out he was walking right into God's backyard, and that's where he had that turning point that Zach talked about. And Moses, again, he had tried to put things out of sight and out of mind in his life. There's things that he had seen in Egypt. Again, if you know the Prince of Egypt story, those things are pretty accurate there. All those things he had seen, he knew they were wrong. As Zach said, he had a sense of justice. And there were things that he knew that deep down, he was supposed to be a part of the fixing, but he was kind of running away from that, He knew he needed to be there. He saw what he did to the Egyptian. He tried to break up things, and the fights between his brothers and so forth. So he had it down in there, and he thought, I'm just going to run away from all this stuff. But it had all caught up with him. And this is 40 years later. 40 years later, it had caught up with him now at age 80. He was 80 years old, and he was just chilling in Midian. That's what his life was about. He was very comfortable. And that's where he found himself when God caught back up with him. Because he had not outrun God. But God had been preparing him all along, even in that kind of comfortable life that he had. He had been preparing him all along for this next phase of the journey. As Zach said, he was trained in Egypt. People talk about him being this stutterer. And quite frankly, I think that's, if you ever hear that, I don't think that's really true. There's really nothing ever that tells us he was a stutterer. There are some Jewish midrashes and so forth where rabbis say, well, he burned his tongue as a child, and that's how he couldn't talk. Really, there's nothing about that other than Moses' excuses. I can't really talk that well. That's the only place. I'm slow of heavy tongue is what he said. It doesn't necessarily mean he stuttered. In fact, we know he was trained in the best universities in Egypt. So he had that, and then also he's got this training just as a shepherd. Like Zach said, feeding animals. I don't know if they scooped up after the animals back then. Probably not. Didn't have little bags on the trail, but there was some humbling, regular old work there. And, again, so he had been prepared even in the midst of that. He didn't think he was running away. He was still being prepared in that. And I think that's certainly something for us to apply from this text, because, I'm sure that many of us often see things or have vision. Maybe at some point in your life you wanted to do something, and there was a cause or whatever it might have been, and you might have been compelled to get involved. But then maybe you got involved, or maybe something held you back. And maybe you did like Moses and said, who am I to do this, really? And your mind's kind of fast forward through the scenarios of, oh, this could happen, that could happen, this isn't going to work. So not only who am I, but what are people going to think of me? Maybe that crosses your mind as well. And before you know it, 40 years goes by. Before I knew it, 13 years went by. I guarantee you, I'm seeing that today. So before you know it, 40 years goes by. And so I think what we need is a shift in our thinking, and to understand that, if God is speaking to us, or if we're seeing something that we feel we need to be involved with, then maybe, just maybe, despite all of those mitigating factors that we put on the situation, maybe it does go beyond our finite abilities, and that God himself will be involved, and it could actually happen, that thing that you think you need to be involved with, or that God's putting on your heart to do. And Moses, he was awkward, he was unsure of himself at first. There's no question that he was very, very unsure of himself. If you were to read on in the story after where it stopped today in chapter 6, you keep going, as the story continues, he does start off very tentatively. He does need that help from Aaron, his brother, who gets sent with him and so forth. He needs all that stuff. But as the story continues, as he's walking in faith, you don't see Aaron anymore. Aaron kind of fades into the background. And then Moses, this supposed unqualified stutterer, becomes much more confident. And again, not confident, I don't think he was confident because he was just doing more of it. He was seeing these amazing things happen, when the plagues or the miracles that we read about in the 10 plagues. He was seeing those things happen. And so I think he was getting more and more confident in that his calling was actually backed by God. And he was much more confident to then move on from that turning point. And don't forget, that turning point in his life was at age 80. After 40 years of supposed, just shepherding. Because ultimately, it really, again, was not about Moses and how great he was. It was about whether or not Moses was going to leave the comfort and the resignation of his life in Midian, and to get back out there and live out his God-given destiny. And I think, like Moses, it's not about you either, but it's about having the faith to get up and to leave Midian. And so we've all got a particular background and history. Again, Moses was brought up in Pharaoh's house. I don't know if anyone here was brought up in a royal palace or not, but that was his background. And then, he lived the second 40 years of his life in the land of Midian, especially with the middle part of his life. Away from all that, away from his biological family, even away from the cultural family that he grew up with, his adopted people. And then he needed to face the reality that God had called him to return to Egypt to carry out those plans, that Moses was in fact the perfect person for the job, despite all his excuses, but that regardless, it was God's plan, and he would see that it would be successful. It really wasn't even about Moses' skills, although he had those particular skills and background. And then it wasn't smooth sailing. He experienced doubts and hardships and setbacks, and a major upheaval in his life he experienced. But nonetheless, God had preserved him, and he had a purpose for him. And again, like Moses, you have a particular background in a history. This is not a cookie-cutter kind of a message or anything. But regardless of your past, whether you know it or even see it, God has preserved you and prepared you and has a purpose for you. And you've got to be ready to just get up and leave Midian. So let's pray as we close. Avinu v'malkeinu, Lord, our Father and our King, we thank you first of all, for this joyous day and this occasion that we have to meet and to celebrate today. We thank you for this wonderful story of Moses in the Exodus, a story that involves obstacles, fears, delays, and faith. It may be an encouragement today, the story to anyone here today that might be struggling with just letting go of their own comfortable life, their own comfortable comings and goings in their own land of Midian. I pray, Lord, that you would help them and help us to have the faith to trust beyond ourselves and to believe that there might just be a larger plan and purpose for each of us. Because in your name we pray. Amen. So we're doing good on time, actually. We're going to take just a few moments here. I think Michael's here and Floyd and the Grants. We're going to just have a few people up here. We're going to play a few songs. Are we prepared with that or no? Maybe not. Vlad or no? If we're not, then I'm going to change that then, because we don't have any, unless you have any. No, we won't do that then. Sorry, Michael.
Yeah, I have the.
I forgot about the iPod up there. Technical issues always, right? So let's just maybe invite James up here. James, if you want to close us out in our Kiddush. And you're saying no. You said earlier yes, but we're going to close out with the Kiddush. This is a traditional prayer over the bread and wine. And afterwards, if you'd like to come get a little piece and dip in the wine, you can. We're also going to have prayer before our reception over there. You got a mic? We're going to have some, once we conclude this prayer, you can mill about, you can go down there if you want to you can mill about and talk to folks here, but also just make your way eventually down into the rotunda area, the commons area. And you can have a seat at the table. There's some, just a small mix and things just to keep you going for a minute while they finish setting up over there, and then we'll open up with a prayer over the food, and then we will have our reception. So that'll happen after James does this blessing as well as a closing benediction.